Bedtime, Part 2. After writing my account of an horrific experience I had as an 8-year-old child, many have encouraged me to speak about the aftermath. I've been hesitant to do so as I have felt unsettled since I broke my silence. Sleep has not come easy to me the last few nights. My skepticism, however, remains resilient, and as such, I will tell you of what I experienced in the other room. This won't be as long, as what occurred only took place over a few nights, but that was way more than enough for me. If you recall, after that unwelcome nightly visitor left me, I was moved into another bedroom a year later. This room was much larger than the previous one and had a warm and welcoming atmosphere to it. Some places feel bad. The room before felt foul, but this one did not. Thankfully, I was given a normal bed. The previous one was taken apart and then thrown out, a welcome sight, might I add. I love my new room. I enjoyed the space for all my toys. I was happy that this place was large enough to have all my friends drop by, but most of all, I was relieved to just be out of that uneasy, foreboding part of the house. On the first night, I slept rather soundly, more so than I had done in a long, long time. Of course, I still moved my bed several feet from the wall. I told my mother that I and my friends liked to use the gap between the bed and the wall as a hiding space for when we were playing. I awoke the next day feeling refreshed and relaxed. As I lay there watching some of my favorite cartoons on a small portable television, I noticed something odd. An old dark brown armchair, which had always been there, sat at the foot of my bed, large and looming. It was frayed and worn, having been given to us as part of a suite by my cousin. But it had been used many, many times even before then. The chair itself was not unusual, but what unsettled me was that I could have sworn that before I had gone to sleep, the chair was facing away from the bed. Now in the cold light of day, the chair was facing me. I assumed one of my parents had moved it while I slept, probably looking for something which had been left there before we switched rooms. The second night was not as restful. It was around 11 p.m. and I could hear my parents' television on the other side of the house. The room was largely in darkness. The only illumination was an orange hue drifting through my window from a street light outside. I lay there content. Content until I heard something quiet, yet unmistakable. At first I thought it was the sound of my own breath, exhaling and inhaling as I rested. But when I stopped for a moment, the quiet, almost inaudible sound of someone else in the room breathing in and out did not cease. It continued, rhythmically and without pause. I lay there in the darkness, but while I was still recovering from the terror instilled in me from my experiences in the previous bedroom, I was not entirely afraid. The breath was so distant and unlike the wheezing I had heard during my encounter with that thing on the wall that I remained calm, and even at the early stage I believed that it was so subtle that it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I took no chances. I stepped out of bed, walked across the room, and turned the light on. The sound had gone. I stared at the old worn armchair facing the foot of my bed, which was within reaching distance of where I slept, and turned it around to face the other way. I had no real reason to do so, but something about it sitting there just filled me with dread. The third night, I was not so fearless. Again, I awoke in darkness. Lying on my back, I stared up at the ceiling, which seemed to happily absorb the dim orange light from the street. The tree outside my window swayed in a calm breeze, casting an orange collection of improbable moving shadows across the room. I could hear nothing but the long and distant hum of the city's night traffic. Just as I began to drift back to sleep, I heard it. A creak from the bottom of my bed, as if something had moved or shifted its weight on the floor. I raised my head, peering through the darkness, but saw nothing strange. Everything sat as it had done throughout the day. Nothing was out of place. I cast my gaze across the room, some comics on the floor, a few boxes which I still yet to unpack. The armchair, unmoved, still facing away from the bottom of the bed. There was nothing sinister here. I was now fully awake, glancing over at my television, considering whether or not to enjoy some late-night TV. I'd have to keep the volume low, of course, as my older brother would hear it in the next room and no doubt tell me to switch it off. Just as I sat fully up in bed, I heard it again. A low creak accompanied by a sound of slightest movements. I looked again at the room. The dim orange shadows cast by the leaves hanging by my window now took an even more menacing form. I still saw no reason to be afraid. I stared at the chair at the end of my bed and saw nothing unusual about it. It's quite common for the mind to take a moment to fully come to terms with what it is seeing. It takes time to put a full horror of what is in front of you together into a moment of cold, bitter realization. Yes, I was staring at the old, worn armchair in the dark. But what I was also staring at was the person sitting in it. In the dim light, I could see the outline of the back of their head, the rest obscured by the spine of the chair. I sat motionless, staring, praying, hoping that my eyes were being misled by their surroundings. The slow creak of movement as it shifted in its battered throne chilled me to my very core. This was no mere trick of the dark. Then, it shifted onto its right side. I knew what it was doing. It was turning to look at me. It was difficult to make out, for even in that room, it seemed darker than everything around it. I saw what looked like a collection of long fingers slip over the crest of the chair, and then another. The room was silent but for the sound of this thing shuffling in its seat and the crash in my racing heart. At first, I could only make out the outline of its forehead, but then it began to rise up, revealing 2 pinpoints of light in the dark recesses of deeply set eye sockets. It was staring at me. I screamed, and within a moment my brother and mother came into the room, switching the light on, asking if I had another bad dream. I sat speechless, barely acknowledging them, staring intently at the now empty armchair. I was only in that room for another few days before we suddenly moved. I saw nothing for the remaining nights, except for my last sleep in that room where I awoke to the warm air of something breathing in my ear. I jumped out of bed, turning the lights on. The slow rhythmic breath of something unseen remained, louder than before. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room. 2 years later, I slept soundly in my bed, in our new house. There had been no other incidences, and I was sure I had left behind whatever strangeness had plagued me in that little average suburban home. I was, however, left one parting gift. My tormentors, and in my opinion, the watcher in that armchair, was a different entity than the thing in the elongated room, had one last surprise in store for me. Like an animal claiming its territory, I was not entirely out of their grasp. For one last terrifying moment, I felt the presence of those things. I lay there sound asleep, 2 years since those horrifying experiences. I was in the throes of a nightmare and suddenly, happily, found myself awake, safe and sound in my bed. The room was darker than usual. I breathed a sigh of relief as one does when waking from a nightmare. But the room was so dark. I could see nothing at all, as if something had snuffed out the light. I chuckled to myself, realizing that I must have pulled a blanket up over my face while I was sleeping. The cotton blanket felt cool against me, but the air was a little too warm, almost stifling. Just as I was about to remove the blanket for some air, I heard it. For the last time I heard it. The rhythmic breathing of the watcher at the end of my bed. Fear gripped me, followed by anger and despair. Why could I not be left alone? And then I did something most peculiar. I decided to speak to it. Perhaps the thing did not mean to harm me. Perhaps it was unaware of the terror it had caused. Surely, a young boy deserved some mercy. As the breathing grew louder and closer, I began to cry. I could feel its presence on the other side of the blanket, its breath hanging over me like a stagnant wind. Through the tears, I uttered 2 words, words which surely would put an end to all this. Please stop. The breathing began to change. It became more animated, quicker somehow. I could hear something shuffling next to me, standing close by. The breathing then moved, first back to the foot of my bed, and then slowly across the room, through the door, into the hallway, and then gone. Half crying, half elated, I lay in the still darkness, my face still covered by the blanket. You may consider this a victory of some sort, but I do not. If those things were real, I know now beyond a shadow of a doubt that their intentions were not misconstrued. They were twisted, filled with malice. I would normally never use such a word to describe anything, but it's as close to evil as I hope to ever come. How do I know that? I'll tell you how. Moments after that thing seemed to have left the house, something pressed forcefully down on top of me, pushing the blanket with great strength against my face. I could feel a large hand with long, thin fingers wrapping the covers around my skull, its nails imprinted upon me like razor-sharp ridges. I managed to slide down into the gap between the bed and the wall, quickly making my escape, clambering and screaming out of my room, waking my family. Make no mistake, that thing in the darkness tried to smother me. Smother me to death. Part 3. My fears realized. A few days ago, I submitted 2 nightmarish accounts from my childhood. Perhaps you best read them to truly comprehend what has befallen me. I have been compelled to silence, gripped by a rational fear that somehow, even after all these years, should I speak of it, those things would seek me out and once again wreak havoc in my life. In the name of science and reason, I confronted those fears and set out to vanquish those tormented memories once and for all by sharing them with others, exposing them for what I believed they were, the delusions of a troubled child. I have held on to my skepticism and rationality for dear life. I have allowed them to define me. But this morning, I was presented with verifiable physical evidence. Evidence of what? I do not know. But it cannot be ignored, and it seems strange to me that the last few days have been so tainted by apprehension and misfortune after finally breaking my silence. So much so that I can no longer rely upon entirely conventional explanations. In the wake of sharing those traumatic experiences as a child, I have been plagued by an overwhelming sense of unease. Initially, I attributed this to just fear that I had experienced in simply recounting and reliving those terrible events in my mind. But as the days passed, it felt like so much more. A feeling of impending doom consumed my every thought. While sleep came to me, rest did not. Each morning I awoke, my nerves on edge, as if deprived of sleep for an age. Nothing overtly frightening happened during those first few nights. No visitations, no unwelcome bedfellows, no wheezing breaths reaching out from deep within my bedroom walls. But I had that distinctly familiar feeling of not being alone. Do not misunderstand. I did not sense someone in the room with me. I did not hear, smell, or feel anything remotely supernatural. But throughout my days and nights, I have sensed something subtle, almost on the periphery of my awareness. The feeling that something is on its way. Something is coming. Like the first few stagnant blasts of air from a subway tunnel, heralding the arrival of a lurching, unstoppable monstrosity. Surprising, yet expected. My sense of unease grew with each passing day, pushing its way under my skin, deep into my mind like some form of cancerous infection. I tried to focus my attention on various writing projects in a vain attempt to fill my mind to the brim with other thoughts, hopefully leaving no room for those contaminated memories, but those thoughts come to me nonetheless. My anxiety gained momentum until I could think of nothing else. I had to do something. I had studied psychology for years at university, but with this I knew that anxiety is often a result of a loss of control, and that one of the most effective ways to combat it is to empower oneself. And this is what I intended to do. Call it foolhardy, but I was going to go back to that place, that house where those terrible events took place. I was going to confront those memories and expose them for what they were. Nonsense. It was an hour's drive to my old house, but it was one filled with elation. I was confident, at ease, happy. I was in control now, and nothing was going to get in the way from showing that place I had feared my entire life that it was nothing but an average, humdrum, harmless little suburban house. Gleefully negotiating the country roads and then the motorway, I finally made it to the city. Gradually, the streets began to take on a familiar appearance. Memories of playing in that neighborhood came flooding back to me. A play park with my favorite slide, an ash pitch where we used to play football. My schoolyard filled with hide and seek and friendships long since abandoned, but never forgotten. My mind wandered through those memories, like a prodigal son walking home. Wandered so much so that before I realized it, I was pulling into the street where I had once lived. The road was long and disappeared far into the distance, finally entering into a sharp, blind turn. It was an old neighborhood, and had been planned and built long before the advent of the car. This was evident by the narrowness of the roads, creating a strangely claustrophobic feeling, as if the houses on each side rose up, leering at passerbys. I slowed my speed and cast my eye over each house that passed. It was a uniform place, with each house looking not dissimilar. My heart suddenly began to beat faster as a cold chill crawled up my spine. There it was. There was the house. It was late afternoon and the street was quiet, almost lonely. I stared at the little place, wondering how such an ordinary home could have instilled so much fear in me. I had initially intended to only look at the house from afar, confirming to me as a material construction, entirely explicable, and removed from anything uncanny. But as I parked and took a deep breath, before I knew it, I was out of my car and walking towards that old metallic gate. That once bright floral shapes, now darkened by age, flaking deep green paint, revealing nothing but rust underneath. I ran my fingers over the uneven top, and with a subtle grasp, I pushed it open. Walking along the path, I was shocked by how disused the garden was. I thought to myself how much of a waste of a good lawn it was, which was all but obscured by a thick mosaic of weeds and other invasive species. But as I neared the house, I realized why. It was unoccupied. Once again, a shudder crept through me, but as my anxiety rose up, I crushed it with my rational mantra. The simplest of explanations is usually the correct one. I assumed that due to the current economic climate that the house had probably just been on the market for some time, and that the owner wasn't too aware of the old sentiment that the first bite is with the eye. But as I looked around, I could see no for sale sign, nor one to let. It genuinely seemed as though this house had been forgotten, abandoned, and left to rot. The windows at the front of the house were filthy and, as such, almost impossible to see through. But as I wandered around to the back of the building, I could see more clearly inside. I would have imagined that a house such as this one would be empty, but on the contrary, it was entirely occupied. Occupied by the trappings of a modern life. I could see a television sitting in the living room corner, a coffee table with magazines strewn across it, various pieces of furniture sitting as if ready to be used, and a couple cups of coffee sitting on the windowsill, still full, covered in mold. I would have thought the house was lived in, if not for a thick layer of dust lying over everything, accompanied by the occasional spiderweb. It seemed as though the most recent occupants had left in a hurry and never returned. Clambering through a sea of waist-high grass and bushes, I eventually arrived at that little innocuous window at the back of the house. The very sight of it frightened me. But this was mere memory, and not the strange feeling I was being watched from within as I had experienced as a child. Peering in, the room looked eerily similar. I suppose there was little that could be done with a room so small, so oddly narrow. But through the dirt-covered glass, the room looked almost unchanged from when I had slept in it. A bed, a set of drawers, and what looked like an assortment of toys on the floor. A profound sense of anger washed over me momentarily, but I shook it quickly from my mind. The room was clearly that of a child's, and the thought of that thing harming another innocent filled me with contempt for such a thought, and within me swelled the desire to protect any child from such an abomination. As I gazed at the wall, of which a bed lay alongside it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For a moment, and it was only for the slightest, I thought I saw a blanket on top of a bed move. More than that, through the window pane, I could have sworn that I heard a wheezing gasp. Closing my eyes tightly, I repeated another scientific mantra. Science does not owe its debts to imagination. Opening my eyes, I saw nothing but an empty bedroom. No foul spirits, no unearthly things, just a room, no more, no less. I breathed a sigh of relief, as if all was well in the world for the first time in many days. You may think that is wishful thinking, but I genuinely felt that I had shown myself that there was nothing to be scared of, other than an overactive imagination. It was starting to get dark, and I wanted to be home before the night. Filled with confidence now that my anxieties were behind me, there was one last thing I needed to do. When we had left that house, we did so in a hurry. As a child, it was disorientating, even frightening to leave everything I knew behind. But there was one thing left, which I always wondered about. At the bottom of the garden stood a sycamore tree, which looked to be even older than the house was. I was amazed at how unchanged it was. I had grown up, gone on to pastures new, but the old sycamore tree still stood, wise, warm, almost friendly in appearance. I think it's a rite of passage for any child to have a place to hide things. It's often their first experience with independence, something removed from an authority figure. For me, my stash was halfway up the old sycamore. I'm sure I must have looked like a fool, but I happily and gleefully climbed the tree with abandon. The configuration of old branches had changed in places, but overall the happy memories of playing amongst the limbs of the old sycamore, of having a little place of the world to myself away from everyone else, seemed vivid as it was remarkable about how much it had remained unchanged. Halfway up, I caught my breath and smiled to myself. In the central trunk of the tree lay a hollow. Whether it had been created by an animal or perhaps the tug of a gale on a weakened branch long ago, I do not know. But it is where I kept things. If I found something which I was sure would be taken away from me from being inappropriate, into the hollow it would go. The truth is, though, the majority of the items inside were not very interesting, mostly just toys and rarely exotic pieces of contraband like a slingshot or some smoke bombs. I had no reason to hide the toys, but when I was young, it felt adventurous to have a secret. The hollow was dark and filled halfway with rotting leaves, no doubt deposited there from countless autumns. Nevertheless, I reached deep inside to see what remained. I couldn't believe it. I'd found a toy that I had hidden there before we moved, all those years ago. I could feel the plastic in my hand, its sharp edges unmistakable. But the leaves and darkness of the hollow obscured its view from me as I struggled to remove it from the thick, wet mixture of rotting leaves and rainwater. It seemed to be caught amongst a collection of small twigs. The reason I was so excited was that I knew when we had moved that I had left one of my favorite toys behind. A small plastic First World War British soldier. It may not sound like much, but I had grown up on my family's stories of my grandfather's adventures during both wars, and while he had passed away before I was born, I would often act out exaggerated versions of the stories with the small soldier in the role of the hero, my intrepid grandfather. At the time, I thought a hollow was a perfect hiding place for a soldier. My delight, however, quickly turned to horror. I felt sick to my stomach, for as I pulled the soldier out, I realized it was not a toy, but something else entirely. Stuffed into the back of the hollow amongst the sludge and now in my hand was the skeletal remains of a small animal. The bones crunched together in my grip as the few small flakes of hair and flesh left on it putrefied between my fingers. I almost lost my balance as the rotten, potent smell of death escaped through my moist grasp invading my senses. I climbed down carefully, dejected. There was nothing else in the hollow. My toy was gone, probably taken by another child during the subsequent years. What remained of the poor animal, I buried under some loose earth in the garden. I left that place immediately. Despite my unfortunate encounter in the hollow, I still felt empowered that I had actually plucked up the courage to revisit that place, to see how ordinary it really was, which made me feel in control once more of my own faculties. I did not at the time require anything other than a conventional explanation. I said goodbye to my old neighborhood, to the bad memories once and for all, and began to make my way home. By the time I had driven onto the motorway, something had begun to filter through the back of my subconscious. At first, I disregarded it, dismissing it as my imagination. But as the sun shone its last and dipped below the horizon, I sensed the growing of a compulsion in me, an idea which seemed to have been born and nurtured for no good reason, no rationale, no sound casual footing, but one which had to be followed at all cost. I must get home. I increased my speed, zipping sporadically between the slower cars in the motorway, looking in the rearview mirror, keeping an eye on what might be following. I had to get home. Again, I drove faster, constantly looking behind me as if racing from some unseen pursuer. 70, 80, 100 miles per hour. I tore along the road. I beeped, I yelled. The sweat lashed off me. What was happening to me? Please, just let me get home. White-knuckled, I finally made it off the motorway and onto the country roads, which led directly to my town. The roads were narrow and wound around a now bleak and ominous countryside. Darkness seemed to blanket the road in front of me. I turned my full beam on and breathed a sigh of relief to see a bright light again, even if artificial. The manic anxiety which had seemed to grip me on the motorway appeared to have diminished. However, I still glared into the rearview mirror, more often than I should have, just to make sure that there was nothing following me. What a ridiculous thought, I think, of something chasing my car. To put myself and others in danger by speeding down a busy motorway? Madness. Still, madness or not, I felt compelled to get away as quickly as possible, and even though I had managed to collect my nerves, the loneliness of the road I was on fueled my yearning for my own town, my own street, and my own bed. Nervously, I traversed the web-like winding roads which seared through the countryside, feeling relieved at first sign of lampposts, of civilization, and of the boundaries of my town. I pulled up outside of my house, switched the engine off, and sat for a moment in silence. I had to stop all of this nonsense. Things coming out of the walls, watchers smothering me at night, looking into someone's window like a prowler, all of this was lunacy. Tomorrow, I would start fresh. No more writing about my childhood experiences, no more reliving of dread-filled nights, just getting back to normal, carrying out my work, spending time with my girlfriend, and most of all, reaffirming my belief, faith, and confidence in science and rationality. Then, the thing in my back seat leant over, grabbed me by my shoulder, and breathed a foul, rancid breath from deep inside its lungs down the back of my neck. I scrambled for the door, my arms flailing around, looking for the lock. Fear possessed me, shook me. A fear I remembered all too well. A fear from all those years ago, lying awake in the night in that sickening room. The sound of the car had grown much colder, but that was nothing compared to the icy fingers burrowing into my shoulder. I honestly thought I was going to die, that this thing would finally get its way after all this time. The door handle popped in my panic grip, and I fell out of the driver's seat onto the pavement. For the briefest of moments, I thought I caught a glimpse of something in the back seat. Vague, the form of an old man, yet twisted and distorted, grinning from ear to ear. Luckily, there was no one around, as, had there been, I would have appeared a mad fool, for the car was empty. I grabbed the keys from the ignition and booted the door shut with my foot, locking it for the night. I staggered down the path into my house. I'm not going to lie to you, but I drank myself to sleep that night. You may recall that I said I had evidence, actual physical evidence of something unnatural. You might be wondering what that evidence is. Well, I could say that it was the marks in my shoulder that made me shudder with fear. Or I could tell you that my bedroom window lying prized open in the morning by what looked like claw marks has left me dreading tonight, or any other. But no, none of that scared me as much as what I saw today upon waking. Sometimes the most frightening of messages are the most simple. For lying on my chest as I awoke in the morning was a toy soldier. The soldier that I had hidden in the hollow all those years ago returned to me as an adult, bitten in half. All right, well, I want to thank you guys for watching. Leaving a like would be fantastic if you did enjoy, and subbing is a good way to stay up to date on when I post. There is a part 4, and I know I said I was going to be covering SCPs next, but unfortunately, actually more fortunately, because I'm actually enjoying this story, there's a part 4, and part 4 is super long, so I'll be reading that next, and then we will go cover an SCP. All right, so I know I mentioned this twice before, but I'm actually about to type in Spotify.com and get everything set up, and then I will be uploading audios there as well. So if you want to check that out, you are more than welcome to, my guy. I think it should be pretty good. All right, well, like I said, appreciate you guys watching, and I will see y'all in the next one.